To understand the art of the ghost, you first have to understand the weight of the silence. For Grace, the morning didn't begin with sunlight, it began with the rhythmic, mechanical precision of a life lived in the margins. Every morning at 5 a.m., she pulled her dark hair back, securing it into a bun so tight it felt like a physical anchor for her thoughts. In the mirror of her cramped apartment, she didn't look for beauty, she looked for a lack of friction. No loose strands. No loud colors. Nothing that would catch the light or the memory of a stranger. In the city of Chicago, invisibility was Grace's only true currency. It was a lesson learned in the bruises of a past life, a survival instinct sharpened by a relationship that had taught her that being noticed was the first step toward being broken. Now, at 26, her philosophy was simple: if they don't see you, they can't hurt you. Her daily grind was a choreographed dance of 3 different lives. At the bakery at dawn, she was the hands that floured the dough. At the midday cafe, she was the blur that cleared the tables. But it was at the gala, the high-end world of marble floors and predatory wealth, where her art of restraint was truly tested. Walking into the dressing room of the elite restaurant, Grace donned her black blazer like a suit of armor. The white collar was crisp, the tie perfectly centered, and the gold name tag, Grace, felt like a lie. Grace wasn't a person here, she was an appliance. She moved through the dining hall with a soft, heel-to-toe gait that made no sound on the polished wood. She had trained her eyes to remain at chest level, never meeting the gaze of the powerful, never inviting a conversation that could lead to a question. She watched the way the rich moved, the way they took up space, oblivious to the shadows refilling their water and whisking away their crumbs. To Grace, their loud voices and expansive gestures were a luxury she couldn't afford. Every movement she made was calculated to leave the smallest possible footprint on the world. She lived for the envelope under the mattress, the growing stack of bills that promised a future where she wouldn't have to hide. But as the rainy November wind rattled the reinforced glass of the ballroom, Grace felt a strange, cold shiver beneath her professional exterior. She had spent years perfecting the art of seeing without being seen, of hearing secrets without appearing to listen. She was a master of the periphery. And tonight, as the city's elite gathered for a dinner that cost more than her yearly rent, her hypervigilance was screaming. She was about to find out that being a ghost is only safe until you see something that wasn't meant for the living. The air in the ballroom of Romano's always carried the scent of expensive cedar and ancient money, but at precisely 7:15 p.m., the oxygen seemed to vanish from the room. It wasn't a loud entrance. There were no trumpets, no grand announcements, only the sudden, rhythmic thud of heavy mahogany doors swinging open. Grace, standing in her designated shadow near the velvet curtains, felt the shift before she saw him. The frantic chatter of the city's elite didn't stop, it simply changed pitch, dropping into a respectful, wary hum. Enzo Rossi didn't walk into a room, he occupied it. He was a man shaped by decades of cold calculations and absolute rule, his presence as sharp as the crease in his midnight blue suit. As he moved toward table 4, his graying hair caught the light of the crystal chandeliers, a silver crown for a man who ruled a digital and concrete empire. He moved with a predatory grace, an effortless, terrifying confidence that signaled he was the most dangerous entity in the building. To the people at the surrounding tables, he was a god to be courted. To Grace, he was the ultimate test of her invisibility. He took his seat at the head of the private table, his back to the wall, positioned so his dark, observant eyes could sweep the entire floor. He was flanked by 4 men, associates who wore their wealth like loud jewelry, their laughter too forced, their smiles too wide. They were the scavengers following the lion, hoping for a scrap of his influence. Grace watched from the periphery as her manager practically folded in half, his voice trembling with a desperate need to please. Grace, the manager hissed, appearing at her side like a ghost. Table 4. Total silence. Total perfection. If Mr. Rossi so much as blinks in discomfort, consider your career over. Grace nodded once, her face a mask of stone. She adjusted her tray, her heart performing a slow, heavy throb against her ribs. As she approached the table, she could feel Enzo's energy, it was cold, focused, and piercing. He wasn't engaged in the boisterous talk of his companions, he sat with a terrifying stillness, his luxury watch glinting as his hands rested flat on the white linen. For a fleeting second, his gaze drifted toward her. It wasn't the dismissive glance she was used to from the wealthy. It was a look of sharp, clinical perception, as if he were looking past her uniform and directly at the secrets she kept buried in her marrow. Grace didn't flinch. She lowered her head just enough to break the connection, sliding into her role as the silent servant. She began to pour the water, her movements robotic and flawless, yet her skin prickled with a new, dangerous electricity. The lion had arrived, and Grace realized that in a room full of predators, she was the only one who knew the difference between a dinner and an ambush. The private room at table 4 felt like a vacuum, sucking the warmth out of the gala until only the cold friction of hidden agendas remained. Grace moved like a shadow, a silent ghost orbiting the center of power. Her hands were steady, her breathing shallow, but her eyes, those sharp, hypervigilant eyes she had used to survive the streets, missed nothing. She was refilling the breadbasket when the air shifted. It was a micro-movement, a glitch in the choreography of the dinner that only a woman trained in the art of the periphery could detect. To Enzo's right sat Marcus, a man whose smile was as polished as his silver cufflinks, a man who had called Enzo brother only 10 minutes prior. As Enzo leaned forward to look at a document presented by the man across from him, Marcus's hand drifted. It was a casual, lazy motion, his left arm draped over the back of his chair while his right hand hovered over Enzo's crystal wine glass. From his palm, a tiny glass vial, no larger than a teardrop, emerged. With a flick of a finger, a single, clear bead of liquid plummeted into the deep crimson of the vintage red. It didn't splash. It didn't fizz. It simply vanished, merging with the wine like a secret entering a grave. Grace's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of ribs. The world slowed down to the beat of her pulse. She saw Marcus tuck the vial back into his sleeve, his expression returning to one of bored affluence. In less than a minute, Enzo would reach for that glass. He would take a sip to seal a deal, and by the time the dessert arrived, he would be a memory. A terrifying internal war erupted within Grace. Her instincts, the ones that had kept her alive for 26 years, screamed at her to turn around. "Stay invisible," they whispered. "If you speak, they will kill you. If you interfere, you lose your job, your safety, your daughter's future. It isn't your glass. It isn't your life." She thought of her envelope under the mattress, her quiet. But then she looked at Enzo. He wasn't just a billionaire in that moment, he was a man who breathed, a man who had a pulse, a man about to be extinguished by a hand he trusted. If she walked away, she wasn't just staying safe, she was becoming an accomplice. The restraint she had practiced her whole life felt like a chokehold. She had spent so long being a shadow, but a shadow couldn't save a life. Only a person could do that. And for the first time in years, Grace realized that if she wanted to be more than a ghost, she had to stop being afraid of the light. She had 3 seconds to choose her soul over her safety. The time for contemplation evaporated, leaving only the cold, hard necessity of action. Grace moved. She didn't rush, a rush would be noticed. Instead, she deepened her role, becoming the epitome of the perfect, attentive servant. She glided toward table 4, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet, her tray balanced with the practiced ease of someone who had spent 1,000 nights carrying the weight of others' luxuries. The air around Enzo was thick with the smell of cigars and the heavy scent of the poisoned Cabernet. Marcus was laughing now, a sharp, triumphant sound, as he watched Enzo's hand begin to drift toward the stem of the deadly glass. Grace's vision tunneled. The room blurred, the crystal chandeliers, the hum of the gala, the distant piano, until all that existed was the glass of light-colored water on her tray and the dark red wine on the table. She arrived at Enzo's shoulder just as his fingers brushed the crystal. With a fluid, hypnotic motion, Grace leaned in to clear a small, empty appetizer plate. It was a move she had performed 10,000 times, but tonight, every nerve ending was on fire. As her left hand swept the plate, her right hand, shielded by the curve of her own body and the broad shoulders of the men sitting beside Enzo, descended. In one seamless, silent blur, she set the water glass down directly in the path of Enzo's reaching hand while her fingers hooked the stem of the wine. It was a heist performed in broad daylight, a sleight of hand that relied entirely on the billionaire's momentary distraction. She didn't just move the glass, she replaced it so perfectly that the condensation rings on the white linen almost aligned. But as she pulled the poisoned wine back onto her tray, the tray tilted. A single, heavy drop of red liquid escaped, splashing onto the pristine white tablecloth like a gout of blood. The sound of the glass settling onto the tray felt like a gunshot in the sudden silence of her own mind. Enzo froze. His hand was wrapped around the water glass she had just placed there, but his eyes weren't on the drink. He looked down at the red stain spreading on the cloth, then slowly, his gaze climbed upward. He didn't look at her hands or her uniform. He looked straight into her eyes. Grace felt her heart stop. She was caught. She was standing there, holding the evidence of a murder plot on her tray, while the man she had just saved stared at her with a piercing, lethal intelligence. To the rest of the table, it looked like a clumsy mistake, a waitress fumbling a glass. But as Enzo's grip tightened on the water, his expression shifted from confusion to a terrifying, razor-sharp realization. He knew. In the heavy silence that followed, Grace realized she was no longer a ghost. She was a witness, and the lion was finally looking back. The silence at table 4 became a living thing, heavy and suffocating. To Marcus and the other men, it was merely an awkward beat, a clumsy waitress spilling a drop of wine on a pristine setting. They expected Enzo to snap, to dismiss her with a cold wave of his hand, or to demand the manager. But the air didn't ignite with anger. Instead, it grew unnervingly still. Enzo's fingers remained curled around the glass of water Grace had placed in his path. He didn't look at the spill. He didn't look at Marcus. He remained fixed on Grace, his dark eyes searching hers with a clinical, terrifying intensity. In that gaze, Grace felt her invisibility shatter completely. He wasn't seeing a servant, he was reading the frantic pulse in her neck, the slight tremor in the tray she held, and the desperate, silent warning written in her stare. Slowly, Enzo lowered his gaze to the tray. He saw the glass of deep red wine she had intercepted, the glass Marcus had just seasoned with a clear death. Then, he looked at Marcus, who was leaning back with an expectant, oily grin, waiting for his friend to take a celebratory sip. The contrast was a lightning bolt of clarity. Enzo was a man who had built an empire on the ability to detect a lie before it was even spoken, and in the span of 3 heartbeats, the puzzle pieces locked into place. He realized why the clumsy waitress had breached protocol. He realized that the water in his hand was life, and the wine on her tray was an ending. A spill, Marcus finally drawled, his voice breaking the tension like a dull knife. Really, Enzo, the service here has gone to the dogs. Have the girl replaced. Enzo didn't blink. He finally broke eye contact with Grace, but the warmth did not return to his face. He looked at Marcus, and for the first time, Grace saw the true face of the billionaire, a mask of absolute, lethal ice. The service is exactly what it needs to be, Marcus, Enzo said, his voice a low, vibrating growl that made the other man's smile falter. He turned back to Grace, and for a fraction of a second, the iron in his expression softened into something that looked dangerously like respect. Leave the tray. Get a fresh cloth for the table. And stay close. I suspect I'll be needing your assistance for the rest of the evening. Grace nodded, her breath finally hitching in her chest. She stepped back into the shadows, but the safety of the dark was gone. She had saved the lion, but in doing so, she had stepped directly into the center of the pride's war. As Marcus's eyes darted nervously between the spilled wine and Enzo's unreadable face, Grace realized the hunt had shifted. The prey was no longer Enzo Rossi. It was her. The cold Chicago air hit Grace like a physical blow as she stepped out of the service entrance, but it couldn't chill the feverish heat of her racing heart. The gala was behind her, but the weight of Enzo Rossi's gaze felt like a brand on her skin. She had traded her tailored blazer for a worn wool coat, pulling her collar up to hide her face, desperate to settle back into the anonymity of the city's midnight fog. She walked quickly, her boots clicking a frantic rhythm on the wet pavement. Grace lived by a set of internal rules, and rule 1 was simple: trust the shadows. But tonight, the shadows felt different. They felt crowded. As she turned the corner toward the subway entrance, she caught a glimpse of a black sedan idling at the curb, its headlights extinguished. It was too sleek, too quiet for this neighborhood. She didn't look back, she knew better, but her skin began to prickle with the hypervigilance that had saved her once before. She adjusted her bag, her fingers brushing the cold metal of her keys, and ducked into the flickering fluorescent hum of the train station. The platform was nearly empty, save for a man in a gray overcoat standing by a vending machine. He wasn't looking at his phone. He wasn't checking the time. He was looking at the reflection in the glass, and in that reflection, he was watching her. Grace felt a surge of cold nausea. These weren't common street thugs, they moved with a terrifying, synchronized patience. They were cleaners, the professional shadows used by men like Marcus to erase mistakes. And to Marcus, Grace was the biggest mistake of his life. She boarded the train, her eyes darting across the empty car. She sat near the emergency lever, her mind spinning through every possible exit. Every time the train hissed to a stop, she braced herself, watching the doors. 2 stops before her own, the man in the gray coat stepped into the car. He didn't sit near her. He stood at the far end, gripping the silver pole, his expression as blank as a tombstone. Grace realized then that she couldn't go home. If she led them to her apartment, she was leading them to her life, to her daughter, to the only thing she had left to lose. The realization hit her with the force of a tidal wave. She had saved a billionaire, but she had destroyed her invisibility. She was no longer a ghost, she was a target. As the train roared through the dark tunnels, Grace reached into her pocket and felt the small, embossed business card Enzo had slipped into her hand before she fled the restaurant. It was a lifeline she never wanted to use, but as the man in the gray coat took a slow, deliberate step toward her, she knew the art of restraint was over. The hunt had begun. The subway doors hissed open at a station that wasn't hers, and Grace bolted. She scrambled up the concrete stairs, her lungs burning against the biting Chicago wind, and dove into a narrow alleyway flanked by towering brick walls. Behind her, the rhythmic, heavy footfalls of the man in the gray coat grew louder, echoing with a terrifying, mechanical persistence. She was cornered, her back against a rusted fire escape, her fingers trembling as she clutched the business card Enzo had given her. She hadn't even dialed the number before the headlights blinded her. A sleek, armored SUV roared into the mouth of the alley, its tires screaming against the wet asphalt. The man in the gray coat vanished into the shadows like a startled rat as the passenger door swung open. "Get in," a voice commanded. It wasn't a request, it was an anchor thrown into a stormy sea. Grace scrambled inside, the heavy door thudding shut with a sound like a bank vault ceiling. The interior smelled of expensive leather and cold ozone. In the back seat, bathed in the dim blue glow of a laptop screen, sat Enzo Rossi. He didn't look at her immediately, his fingers were flying across a keyboard, his face a mask of digital shadows and hard lines. "You're late," he said quietly, finally looking up. The sharp, clinical perception was still there, but beneath it was a simmering fury, not at her, but at the world that had dared to touch his savior. "I've had a team on your tail since you left the kitchen. They nearly lost you at the station." They drove in a silence that felt different from the one Grace had cultivated. This wasn't the silence of a ghost, it was the silence of an army. As the city skyline began to recede, replaced by the iron gates of a sprawling estate, Grace felt the world she knew dissolving. The car wound through a forest of security cameras and motion sensors until the ivory tower emerged, a monolith of glass, steel, and stone perched above the lake. Entering the estate felt like stepping into the future. The air was filtered, the lighting was intuitive, and every surface hummed with the quiet power of a man who controlled his environment absolutely. Enzo led her into a vast, minimalist study where the walls were lined with monitors displaying global markets and security feeds. "This is the only place in this city where the blurred figures cannot reach you," Enzo said, turning to face her. He looked at her worn coat and her trembling hands, and for the first time, he saw the human cost of her restraint. You spent your life trying to be invisible, Grace. But in this house, you are the only person who matters. You saved a lion, now, you have to learn what it's like to live in his den. Grace looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the dark water below. She was safe, but she realized with a start that the ivory tower was just another kind of cage. The only difference was that this one was built to keep the rest of the world out. The transition from the cold, rain-slicked streets to the warmth of the estate felt like a fever dream. Grace stood in the center of the vast kitchen, her hands wrapped around a porcelain mug of tea that cost more than her month's rent. She had shed her wool coat, but she still wore the black waiter's vest and the white-collared shirt. She felt like a stain on the perfection of the room, a reminder of a world that Enzo Rossi was supposed to have moved beyond. Enzo stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his tie loosened, his jacket discarded on a nearby chair. For the first time, he didn't look like the titan of industry who moved markets with a whisper. He looked tired. The harsh light of the security monitors reflected in his eyes, highlighting the gray at his temples and the deep lines of a man who had spent 40 years looking over his shoulder. "You're still wearing it," Enzo said quietly, gesturing to her uniform. "It's the only thing I have," Grace replied, her voice sounding small in the cathedral-like silence of the house. Enzo turned, a faint, weary smile playing on his lips. "I've worn a suit every day for 30 years. To the world, it's a symbol of power. To me, it's just armor. Just like your vest. We both spent our lives dressing for the people we were afraid of." Grace looked down at her hands. "I wore this so I could disappear. I thought if I looked like everyone else, if I moved like a machine, I'd be safe. I spent so long perfecting the art of being nothing that I forgot how to be someone. And I spent so long being Rossi that I forgot I was Enzo," he admitted, stepping closer. The distance between them, usually measured in billions of dollars and social castes, seemed to evaporate in the dim light. "They think I'm the predator, Grace. But Marcus and the others, they see me as a prize. A target. Just like those men in the gray coats see you." In that quiet hour, the ivory tower didn't feel like a fortress or a cage, it felt like a mirror. Grace realized that Enzo's wealth was a different kind of invisibility, a golden mask that kept the world from seeing the man beneath the empire. They were two prisoners of their own making, bound by the roles they had performed to survive. For the first time in her life, Grace didn't feel the need to look at the floor. She looked at him, and Enzo looked back, not as a master or a savior, but as a man who finally recognized a kindred spirit in the dark. The uniforms were still there, but the ghosts wearing them were finally starting to wake up. The sanctuary of the ivory tower was safe, but it was also a stalemate, and Enzo Rossi was not a man who accepted a draw. By the third day, the air in the estate felt heavy with the unspoken truth. The only way for Grace to truly be free was to return to the world that had tried to erase her. They spent the night preparing, not with weapons, but with technology that vanished into the fabric of her past. The conspirators were meeting at a private lounge downtown to finalize the merger that Enzo's death was supposed to facilitate. They expected a ghost, they didn't expect a witness. Grace stood in the service corridor of the lounge, her fingers trembling as she adjusted the familiar weight of the black blazer. Hidden beneath the gold name tag was a microphone no thicker than a needle, and tucked into the cuff of her sleeve was a micro camera that Enzo's team monitored from a van 3 blocks away. "You don't have to do this, Grace," Enzo's voice crackled softly in her earpiece, sounding more human than he ever had in the boardroom. "I've been invisible my whole life, Enzo," she whispered, smoothing her hair into that tight, professional bun. "It's time to use it for something that matters." She stepped through the double doors, entering a room thick with the smell of scotch and the stench of unearned victory. Marcus was there, sitting at the center of the leather booth, his face flushed with the arrogance of a man who thought he had won. He didn't even look up as Grace approached with a tray of crystal glasses. To him, she was just another part of the furniture, a silent tool to be used and ignored. As she leaned over to set the glasses down, Marcus leaned in toward his associates. Enzo was a relic, he sneered, his voice clear and sharp in Grace's hidden microphone. he thought ethics would save him. He never saw the vial coming. And that girl? The waitress? By tomorrow, she'll be a headline in the back of the papers. A tragic accident for a tragic nobody. Grace's hand didn't shake. She didn't flinch as she heard him describe her own murder. Instead, she moved with the cold, mechanical precision she had practiced for years. She adjusted a napkin, lingering just long enough for the camera to capture the faces of every man at the table, their nods of agreement, their shared guilt. She had spent her life staying quiet to survive, but as she turned and walked back toward the service doors, she knew that for the first time, her silence was the loudest thing in the room. She wasn't just clearing plates, she was clearing the path to her own future. The aftermath was not a storm, but a quiet, surgical dismantling. Within hours of Grace stepping out of that lounge, the digital recordings, the cold, recorded evidence of Marcus's arrogance, had reached the hands of the authorities and the board of directors. The blurred figures who had moved through the world with such loud, predatory confidence were suddenly reduced to headlines and mugshots. Marcus never saw the police coming, but Grace watched from the high-security windows of the estate as his empire collapsed in real time. The war was over, won not with weapons, but with the very silence Grace had used to hide for so long. A month later, Grace stood in the lobby of a downtown university, the air smelling of floor wax and possibility. She was no longer wearing the black vest or the white-collared shirt. She wore a simple, olive-green dress, and her hair, once pulled back into a bun so tight it felt like an anchor, now fell loosely over her shoulders. The weight of her hypervigilance had begun to lift, replaced by a strange, light sensation she eventually recognized as hope. Enzo Rossi found her there, leaning against a marble pillar. He looked different, too. The midnight blue suit had been replaced by a casual sweater, and the hard, clinical edge in his eyes had softened into a steady warmth. He didn't approach her as a billionaire or a master, he approached her as a friend who owed a debt he knew he could never truly repay. "The trust has been finalized," Enzo said, sliding a folder toward her. "The tuition, the living expenses, and the house in the suburbs. It's not a gift, Grace. It's the interest on a life saved." Grace looked at the folder, but she didn't feel the old, familiar urge to calculate the cost or look for the trap. She had realized that while Enzo had provided the means, she had provided the courage. She wasn't the help anymore. She wasn't a shadow or a ghost. She was a woman who had seen the worst of the world and decided to protect the best of it. "I'm starting the nursing program on Monday," she said, her voice clear and steady, no longer a whisper meant for the margins. Enzo smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile. "I know. And I suspect you'll be the best they've ever seen. You've always had a talent for seeing what others miss." As she walked out of the building and into the bright Chicago afternoon, Grace didn't look over her shoulder. She didn't check the shadows or scan the street for black sedans. She looked straight ahead, her face tilted toward the sun. She had spent 26 years learning how to be invisible, but as she disappeared into the crowd of students and dreamers, she realized she wasn't hiding anymore. She was just living. The waitress had switched the glass, but the woman had finally changed her world.